Royal Guard sees a beggar with a baby in the rain. What happens next is shocking. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, drumming against the pavement outside Palace with the persistence of a metronome. Royal Guard Daniel Carter felt droplets sliding down his neck, but his posture remained perfect, shoulders back, chin high, eyes forward. 15 years of service had taught him to endure far worse than a London drizzle. But something was different about this dreary Thursday afternoon. Perhaps it was the unusual quiet, with most tourists having sought shelter from the weather, or maybe it was the way the fog hung low over the palace grounds, creating ghostly shapes in the distance. Whatever it was, Daniel felt an unfamiliar tension in his muscles, a soldier's instinct telling him something wasn't quite right. That's when he saw her. Across the street, partially obscured by the rain-slicked iron fence, stood a woman holding what appeared to be a bundle of blankets. At first glance, she might have been just another tourist taking shelter, but several details caught Daniel's trained eye. She wasn't moving to stay warm. She wasn't checking her phone for directions. She wasn't doing any of the 100 little things people normally did when caught in the rain. She just stood there, staring at the ground, while water soaked through her thin jacket and plastered her dark hair to her face. A cry pierced the steady patter of rain, high-pitched, unmistakable. A baby's wail. The bundle in her arms shifted, confirming Daniel's suspicion. The woman's response, however, was what truly set off alarm bells in his mind. Instead of soothing the child or seeking shelter, she merely tightened her grip and continued her unsettling vigil. Daniel had seen countless beggars during his years at the palace. Some were genuine, others professional manipulators, but all of them had one thing in common: they asked for something. Money, food, shelter. There was always a request, always a story. This woman asked for nothing. She didn't even look up at the passing crowds, those few brave souls hurrying past with umbrellas and raincoats. Years of training warred with instinct in Daniel's mind. Royal Guards didn't leave their posts. They didn't engage with civilians unless absolutely necessary. They were living statues, symbols of the crown's authority and tradition. Breaking protocol could cost him his position, a job he'd worked his entire adult life to achieve. The baby cried again, louder this time, the sound seeming to echo off the wet stones of the palace wall. Bloody hell, Daniel muttered under his breath, his decision made before he'd even finished the thought. Something was wrong here. Properly wrong. He stepped forward, breaking his stance for the first time in hours. His boots clicked against the wet pavement as he approached the woman, each step feeling like a small betrayal of his training. As he drew closer, more details emerged that only heightened his concern. Her clothes, though soaked, were of good quality. Her shoes were expensive, if mud-spattered. This wasn't a homeless person or a typical beggar. This was someone who, until very recently, had lived a very different life. "Ma'am?" Daniel kept his voice gentle, professional. "Are you all right? Do you need assistance?" The woman's head snapped up at his voice, and Daniel caught a glimpse of wide, frightened eyes before she quickly looked away again. She reminded him of wounded animals he'd encountered in his childhood, desperate, cornered, dangerous not from aggression but from fear. She began, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I have to." She shifted her weight, adjusting her grip on the baby, and that's when it happened. A thick envelope, partially concealed by the baby's blankets, slipped free and fell to the wet pavement. The woman's reaction was instant and violent. She lunged for it, then stopped herself just as quickly, as if afraid to loosen her grip on the child. The movement gave Daniel a clear view of her face, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. Pure, unadulterated terror. Daniel bent down and retrieved the envelope before the rain could soak through it completely. It was heavy, bulging with what felt like paper and something else, something that made a distinctive sound when it moved. "Money. Let me help you," he said, holding out the envelope while trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Whatever's wrong, there are people who can. He's coming." The words came out in a desperate whisper, her eyes darting to something over Daniel's shoulder. "Oh God, he's coming." Daniel started to turn, to see what had sparked such fear, but movement caught his eye. The envelope had split slightly when it fell, and through the tear, he could see the edge of what looked like a train ticket, along with the corner of what appeared to be a legal document. The glimpse was brief, but it was enough to see figures that made his eyes widen. The amount of cash in that envelope would have paid his salary for months. Before he could process this information, before he could even form another question, the woman's demeanor changed completely. Her spine straightened, her eyes focused, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked directly into Daniel's eyes with an intensity that felt like a physical force. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," she said, her voice suddenly clear and steady. "Now you'll have to choose too." The cryptic statement hung in the air between them, but before Daniel could respond, a sound cut through the steady drum of rain, the low, distinctive purr of an expensive car engine approaching slowly. The woman's face strained of all color. "I have to go," she whispered, her earlier steadiness evaporating like morning mist. "He's coming." The envelope in Daniel's hands suddenly felt very heavy indeed, and he knew, with the certainty that had saved his life more than once in combat, that he was now involved in something far more dangerous than a simple case of a woman and child in distress. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The black Mercedes materialized from the fog like a shark cutting through murky waters. Its tinted windows reflected the gray London sky, making it impossible to see who was inside. But the woman's reaction told Daniel everything he needed to know, the way her entire body tensed, how her knuckles whitened against the baby's blanket, the small step backward she took instinctively. The car slowed to a crawl. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet took only seconds. The woman spun on her heel and ran, not in a panic, but with the calculated precision of someone who had planned this moment. Her feet found purchase on the slick pavement with practiced ease as she darted between startled pedestrians, the baby held tight against her chest. Daniel's training kicked in before his conscious mind could process the decision. 15 years of military service had honed his instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming that he was watching a predator pursue prey. Without a second thought about the protocol he was shattering, he moved. "Control, this is Carter." He spoke into his radio as he ran. "Pursuing a possible." He hesitated. A possible what? What exactly was he chasing? "Situation involving a civilian in distress. Location moving south on gate." The woman was fast, surprisingly so for someone carrying a child. She weaved through the crowd with the grace of a dancer, using confused tourists as obstacles between herself and the black Mercedes, which had pulled away from the curb and was now moving parallel to her flight path. Daniel followed, his boots splashing through puddles as he tried to keep both the woman and the car in sight. His uniform drew startled looks from passers-by, many quickly stepping aside. It wasn't every day you saw a royal guard in full uniform sprinting through the streets of London. The woman glanced back once, her eyes widening when she saw Daniel in pursuit. Was that relief that flickered across her face? Or more fear? She turned sharply, ducking into a narrow alley between two buildings. "Stop!" Daniel called out, knowing even as he said it that she wouldn't. The word was swallowed by the drone of traffic and rain. The Mercedes braked hard at the alley entrance, but the narrow passage prevented it from following. Daniel saw the passenger door begin to open, but he was already halfway down the alley, his longer stride eating up the distance between him and the woman. The alley twisted left, then right, forming a maze of brick walls and fire escapes. Water dripped from above, and the ground was treacherous with old leaves and debris. The woman's footsteps echoed off the walls, growing fainter with each turn. Then silence. Daniel reached another intersection of alleyways and stopped, listening intently. Nothing but the distant sounds of traffic and the steady drip of water. She had vanished as completely as a ghost, taking the baby with her. But the envelope, he still had the envelope she dropped. His radio crackled. "Carter, report status." Daniel looked down at the expensive paper in his hands, now somewhat crushed from his run. Through the torn edge, he could see more clearly now, a train ticket for 11:30 p.m. that very night. Someone had planned this escape down to the minute. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the alley network, followed by footsteps, heavy, purposeful ones. Someone else had joined the chase. Daniel made a quick decision. He tucked the envelope into his uniform jacket and keyed his radio. "Situation resolved," he reported. "Lost sight of the subject. Returning to post." He didn't move immediately, though. Instead, he waited, listening as the footsteps grew closer. A man appeared at the far end of the alley, tall, wearing an expensive suit that seemed untouched by the rain. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. The man's face was like carved stone, emotionless yet somehow radiating authority. He nodded once at Daniel, a gesture that managed to combine acknowledgement and dismissal in a single motion. "Did you see where she went?" the man called out, his voice carrying the kind of casual confidence that came from always being obeyed. Daniel gestured vaguely toward one of the many branching alleys. "Lost her in the maze," he replied, keeping his voice professionally neutral. "These old passages connect to half a dozen streets." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of frustration quickly masked. He pulled out a phone and spoke quietly into it, turning away from Daniel. Taking advantage of the moment, Daniel retreated the way he'd come, maintaining a professional pace until he was back on the main street. The Mercedes was gone, but he could feel eyes on him as he made his way back to his post. The envelope pressed against his chest like a lead weight. He pulled it out just enough to check the train ticket again, 11:30 p.m. from Paddington Station. Someone wanted her gone by then, someone with enough money and influence to send men in expensive cars to ensure it happened. But there was something else nagging at his mind. He'd caught a glimpse of a name on one of the documents during the chase, just a fragment, but enough to know it didn't match the woman he'd seen. Who was she really? And more importantly, whose baby was she carrying? The questions tumbled through his mind as he resumed his post, standing straight and still as tourists began taking pictures again, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. But Daniel's thoughts were far from his duty now, focused instead on the mystery literally close to his heart, sealed in an envelope that shouldn't be in his possession. Hours stretched ahead before that 11:30 train. Hours to decide what to do with information he was never meant to have. The weight of protocol pressed down on Daniel like a physical force as he stood at his post. The envelope concealed within his uniform felt like it was burning through the fabric. Every instinct from his military training screamed at him to report this incident immediately. Someone higher up the chain of command needed to know about the mysterious woman, the baby, the pursuit, and especially about these documents. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the raw fear he'd seen in the woman's eyes, or maybe it was the calculated efficiency of that black Mercedes and its occupant. This wasn't a simple domestic dispute or a random incident. This had the feeling of something bigger, something darker. When his relief finally arrived at the change of guard, Daniel's decision was made. Instead of heading to his superiors, he made his way to a small cafe several blocks from the palace, one frequented by tourists rather than locals. Anonymous. Safe. Finding a corner table with a clear view of both exits, Daniel ordered a coffee and finally allowed himself to examine the contents of the envelope properly. His hands were steady as he carefully spread the documents across the table, but his heart rate quickened as the full picture began to emerge. The first document was a passport, expertly forged, but definitely not genuine. Daniel had seen enough documentation in his military days to spot the subtle inconsistencies. The woman's photos showed her with different colored hair and makeup, but it was unmistakably her. The name listed was Sarah Mitchell, almost certainly an alias. Next came the custody papers, and this was where things got interesting. The document bore the letterhead of one of London's most prestigious law firms, and at the bottom was a signature that made Daniel's coffee grow cold in his cup: Jonathan Carter, CEO of Carter Industries. Even someone who didn't follow business news would recognize that name. Carter's face was plastered across half the financial district, his company's recent tech innovations making headlines worldwide. But it was the handwritten note that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Take the money and leave. This is your last chance." The threat was clear: even if the context wasn't. The paper was expensive, the kind used in high-end stationery sets. This wasn't a hasty scrawl on a torn piece of paper. This was a calculated message. Daniel's hand hesitated over the final document, the birth certificate. As he unfolded it, pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place. The father's name was listed as Jonathan Carter, but the mother's name wasn't, Sarah Mitchell, or any variation of the woman he met. Instead, it listed Rebecca Carter, the tycoon's wife. Something nagged at Daniel's memory. He pulled out his phone and started searching news archives. It took only moments to find what he was looking for, a small article from 8 months ago about Rebecca Carter's tragic death in a household accident. The story had been brief, the details vague. At the time, it had generated little interest beyond a few society pages. But now, Daniel laid the documents side by side, and a disturbing narrative began to form. The dates didn't add up. According to the birth certificate, the baby had been born just 2 months ago, 7 months after Rebecca Carter's death. It was biologically impossible for a dead woman to give birth. His training kicked in, and he began analyzing the information methodically. A powerful businessman's wife dies under mysterious circumstances. A baby appears with paperwork claiming impossible parentage. A terrified woman runs with this child, carrying documents that could destroy carefully constructed lies. Someone wants both woman and child to disappear by 11:30 p.m. The cafe's background chatter faded away as Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. The woman, whoever she really was, had been involved with Carter Industries somehow. Close enough to know something she shouldn't, something worth running from. Something worth being hunted for. A barista's dropped cup made Daniel start, his hand instinctively moving toward where his service weapon would normally be. The sound had broken his concentration, but it had also reminded him of something crucial, the baby's cry. He'd heard it clearly, despite the rain and traffic. It had sounded healthy, strong. Not the cry of a neglected child or one in distress, but rather one that was well cared for, familiar with the woman holding it. Daniel gathered the documents quickly but carefully, his decision crystallizing. The woman wasn't a kidnapper, she was running from something far worse. And she'd chosen to run past Palace, one of the most heavily guarded and surveilled locations in London. That couldn't be coincidence. She'd wanted someone to see her, wanted to create witnesses to whatever was happening. Looking at his watch, Daniel noted the time, 7:45 p.m. Less than 4 hours until that train departed. Less than 4 hours to decide if he was really going to throw away 15 years of service by getting involved in something that every rational part of his brain was telling him to walk away from. The cafe's wall-mounted television caught his attention. A business news channel was showing Jonathan Carter giving a speech at some charity event. The man radiated charm and confidence, his perfect smile never quite reaching his eyes as he spoke about his company's commitment to family values. Daniel looked down at the documents one last time, then at his phone. He had a contact from his military days, someone who could dig deeper, faster than any official channels. Someone who owed him a favor. It was time to find out what was really happening behind Carter Industries' polished facade. Paddington Station at night was a different world from its daytime chaos. The usual rush of commuters had dwindled to a trickle, their hurried footsteps echoing off the Victorian iron and glass architecture. Daniel had changed out of his ceremonial uniform into civilian clothes, but his military bearing remained, earning him a wide berth from the few late-night travelers. His phone buzzed, a message from his contact. Data sent. It's worse than you thought. Watch your back. The attached files would have to wait. It was 11:15 p.m., and Daniel's attention was focused on the platforms, particularly the one where the 11:30 train to Edinburgh would soon depart. The station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the platform, creating dozens of potential hiding spots. Daniel positioned himself near a newspaper stand, his back to a pillar, scanning the sparse crowd. A teenage couple saying goodbye. An elderly man with a crossword puzzle. A woman in business attire checking her watch. None of them matched what he was looking for. At 11:20, The atmosphere shifted. A man in an impeccably tailored suit appeared at the far end of the platform. Even at this distance, Daniel recognized him from the alley, the same stone-faced confidence, the same air of controlled menace. But he wasn't alone. 2 more men in dark suits flanked him, their stances suggesting concealed weapons. "All units in position," a voice murmured from an earpiece the suited man was wearing. "No sign of the target yet." Daniel's jaw tightened. They were treating this like a military operation. Whatever was in those documents, whatever secret this woman held, it was worth mounting a private security operation in one of London's busiest stations. Movement caught his eye, a hooded figure emerging from the shadows near the platform entrance. The woman's steps were measured, careful. She held the baby close, hidden beneath her coat. Her eyes darted across the platform, and for a moment they met Daniel's. Recognition flickered there, followed by something else. Hope? Before she could take another step, the suited man moved to intercept her. His voice carried across the platform, smooth as aged whiskey. "Mrs. Mitchell. Or should I say, Ms. Walker? Time to end this little adventure." The woman's posture changed instantly. Gone was the frightened creature from the palace gates. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted. "Mr. Harrison," she replied, her voice steady despite its softness. "I wondered if he'd send you personally. The boss is very concerned about his child's welfare," Harrison said, taking a step closer. "A newborn needs proper care, proper supervision. Not to be dragged around by a..." He paused, his lip curling slightly. "Former employee. Former surrogate," she corrected, her voice taking on an edge. "And we both know this isn't about the baby's welfare. It's about what I found in his private files. About what really happened to Rebecca." Harrison's pleasant expression didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Please," he said, the word dripping with false concern. "You're confused, emotional. Let us help you." "Help me disappear, you mean?" The woman's laugh held no humor. "Like you helped Rebecca when she discovered the truth about the clinical trials? About the covered-up deaths?" The baby stirred, making a small sound. Harrison's attention snapped to the bundle, his mask slipping for just a moment. "That child belongs with its father. With the proper family. You're nothing but an incubator who's outlived her usefulness. Now, please, don't make this messier than it needs to be. Please," the woman's voice cracked. "Just let me go. You know what he'll do. You know what happened to the others." That's when Daniel stepped forward, his training taking over. "Is there a problem here?" Harrison's head snapped around, genuine surprise registering on his face for a split second before his mask of control returned. He clearly hadn't expected interference, especially not from someone who looked military. "This is a private matter," Harrison said smoothly. "Family issues. Nothing that concerns you, sir." "I believe it does concern me," Daniel replied, moving to stand between Harrison and the woman. "Especially since I have some very interesting documents that might explain why a private security team is threatening a woman and child in a public station." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "You're the guard from earlier. This is far above your pay grade, soldier. Walk away. Forget what you've seen. There could be opportunities for someone with your discretion. Or?" Daniel kept his voice level, but shifted his stance slightly. Behind him, he could hear the woman's quick breathing. "Or things could become very unfortunate," Harrison said softly. "For everyone involved. You don't know who you're dealing with. The reach we have. The resources at our disposal. Is this really how you want to end your career? Your life, perhaps?" The station's PA system crackled. "The 11:30 service to Edinburgh is now approaching platform 4. Please stand behind the yellow line." The rumble of the approaching train filled the air, and in that moment, Daniel made his choice. "Ma'am," he said, not taking his eyes off Harrison, "I believe this is your train." What happened next would be forever seared into Daniel's memory. The train's headlights flooded the platform, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the station floor. In that moment of artificial daylight, the woman made her move, but not the one anyone expected. Instead of running for the train, she spun toward Daniel, and in one fluid motion, pressed the baby into his arms. "Save her," she whispered, her eyes wild with desperate determination. "She's the only proof left." Before Daniel could react, she darted away from both him and the approaching train, sprinting toward the station's main concourse. Harrison's men, caught off guard by the unexpected maneuver, hesitated for a crucial second before giving chase. Harrison himself remained, his eyes locked on the bundle in Daniel's arms. The baby, surprisingly, hadn't made a sound, as if she somehow sensed the gravity of the moment. "That child," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is worth more than you could earn in 10 lifetimes. Hand it over, and we'll forget this unfortunate incident. You can return to your post, your pension intact, your future secure." Daniel looked down at the infant in his arms. Tiny fingers had wrapped around one of his own, the grip surprisingly strong. In that touch, he felt the weight of every moral choice he'd ever made, every oath he'd sworn to protect the innocent. "This has nothing to do with you," Harrison pressed, taking a step closer. "Walk away. Be smart." The baby's grip tightened, and in that moment, everything crystallized in Daniel's mind. The documents he'd read earlier, the fear in the woman's eyes, the clinical way Harrison spoke about a human child, it all painted a picture that made his decision inevitable. "You're right," Daniel said, adjusting his hold on the baby. "This has nothing to do with me. But I'm making it my business anyway." Harrison's mask of civility cracked. "You sanctimonious fool! Do you have any idea what you're getting into? Carter Industries isn't some small-time operation. We have judges in our pocket, politicians on our payroll. One phone call, and your military record becomes a list of disciplinary actions and suspected criminal behavior." The train doors hissed open behind them, passengers beginning to disembark. Daniel took a step backward, positioning himself between Harrison and the baby. "Let me tell you what I do know," Daniel said, his voice carrying the steel of his military years. "I know Rebecca Carter discovered something in those clinical trials that got her finished. I know this child's birth certificate is impossible unless there's a surrogate involved, a surrogate who probably knows too much. And I know my contact in military intelligence is currently going through every file that woman managed to smuggle out of your company." Harrison's face went pale. "You're bluffing." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "But can you afford to take that chance? How many minutes do you think it would take for me to reach the British press? Or better yet, your competitors? I'm sure they'd be very interested in what's been happening in Carter's research division." The station's security cameras swiveled toward them. Someone was paying attention. Harrison noticed too, his eyes darting upward briefly. "This isn't over," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "That child belongs to Mr. Carter. Its mother is dead. No court will. Its mother just ran away," Daniel interrupted. "And I have a platform full of witnesses who saw her hand her baby to me while fleeing armed men. How do you think that will play in tomorrow's papers?" The final boarding call for the Edinburgh train echoed through the station. Harrison's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening further. "She's gone," he muttered, more to himself than Daniel. "Lost her in the crowd." More passengers were filtering onto the platform now, many shooting curious glances at the suited man confronting someone holding a baby. Mobile phones were appearing, recording the scene. The court of public opinion was assembling, and Harrison knew it. "This isn't a victory," Harrison said, straightening his tie. "You've just made yourself a target. Both of you. There's nowhere in Britain you can hide from us." "Then it's a good thing Britain's a relatively small island," Daniel replied calmly. "With lots of boats and planes leaving every day." Harrison's phone buzzed again, urgent this time. With a final glare that promised future retribution, he turned and strode away, speaking rapidly into his earpiece. Daniel waited until Harrison had disappeared into the crowd before looking down at the baby girl in his arms. She was awake now, staring up at him with eyes that seemed far too knowing for an infant. "Well, little one," He murmured, "Your mom's certainly thrown us into the deep end, hasn't she?" The baby's only response was to grip his finger tighter. Daniel knew the next few hours would be crucial. Harrison would regroup, call in resources, start monitoring hospitals and police stations. They'd expect him to run, to hide, to seek official help. Which meant he needed to do something completely unexpected. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number he hadn't called in years. 3 rings, then a gruff voice answered. "Do you still have that place in Cornwall?" Daniel asked without preamble. "The one off the grid?" A pause. "Who's asking?" "Someone who just burned his entire life to the ground to save a baby." A longer pause. Then, "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, little brother. How fast can you get here?" Daniel looked at the departing Edinburgh train, knowing Harrison's men would be watching it. "Give me 8 hours. And Jack? I'm going to need some supplies. The kind we used to handle in Kandahar. Must be some baby." Daniel thought of the documents, of Rebecca Carter's mysterious death, of a surrogate mother desperate enough to trust a stranger with her child. "You have no idea." Dawn broke over Cornwall's rugged coastline, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Daniel stood at the window of his brother's cottage, the baby sleeping peacefully in a makeshift crib nearby. The past 6 hours had been a blur of back roads and switched vehicles, all while Jack's military contacts worked their magic with the information they had. His phone buzzed, a secure message from his intelligence contact. What he read made his blood run cold. The documents the surrogate mother had smuggled out told a story far darker than anyone had imagined. Carter Industries' breakthrough cancer drug hadn't been the miracle everyone thought. The clinical trials had shown devastating side effects, covered up through falsified data and buried reports. Rebecca Carter, with her background in biochemistry, had discovered the truth. But she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd confronted her husband directly, thinking she could appeal to his conscience. 2 days later, she was dead from an accidental fall. The surrogate mother, whose real name was Emily Walker, had been working as a research assistant in the company's medical division. She noticed discrepancies in the data, started digging deeper. When she discovered she was carrying the baby of a man who'd finished his own wife to protect his profits, she'd planned her escape meticulously. The cottage's ancient radio crackled to life, Jack's voice coming through. "Danny, turn on the news. Now." Daniel flipped on the small television they'd set up. The BBC's breaking news banner filled the screen. "Carter Industries CEO arrested in dawn raid." The newsreader's voice was grave. "In a shocking development, Jonathan Carter, CEO of Carter Industries, has been arrested following allegations of corporate fraud, data falsification, and involvement in the death of his wife, Rebecca Carter. Anonymous sources have provided authorities with documents suggesting a systematic cover-up of failed drug trials." "Your girl's been busy." Jack's voice crackled through the radio. "My contacts say she surfaced at a newspaper office with a complete set of backup files. The ones she gave you were just insurance." Daniel looked down at the sleeping baby, understanding dawning. Emily hadn't just been running, she'd been executing a carefully orchestrated plan. The confrontation at Palace, the chase, the train station drama, all of it had been choreographed to create witnesses, to ensure her story couldn't be buried. "There's more," Jack continued. "Carter's head of security, James Harrison, was found an hour ago in his car. But..." He left the implication hanging. Daniel understood. Loose ends were being tied up, either by Carter's other allies or by those who wanted to ensure their own names stayed out of the investigation. The baby stirred, and Daniel gently lifted her. She had Rebecca's eyes. He could see it now in the morning light. A living reminder of the woman who'd first tried to expose the truth. His phone buzzed again, an encrypted message from an unknown number. His heart raced as he read it. "She's safe. Both packages delivered successfully. Thank you for understanding what was at stake. Take care of her until things quiet down. You'll know when it's time. Both packages. The documents and the baby. Emily had orchestrated everything. knowing she needs someone with both the moral compass and the tactical training to help her pull it off. Someone who would choose to do the right thing, even at great personal cost. The news was still playing, showing footage of Carter being led from his mansion in handcuffs. His empire was crumbling in real time, shares plummeting as more revelations emerged. The company's miracle drug was being pulled from the market. Investigations were opening in multiple countries. "What now?" Jack's voice crackled through the radio. Daniel looked at the baby, then at the rising sun over the Cornwall coast. "Now we wait. Keep her safe until her mother can come back for her. And your career?" That made Daniel smile. "Funny thing about that. Seems someone sent a complete dossier to the palace detailing a conspiracy that could have cost thousands of lives. Word is they're quite impressed with the guard who helped expose it all." The baby made a small sound, and Daniel adjusted her blanket. "Besides," he continued, "I think I'm exactly where I need to be right now." 3 months later, Daniel stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace again, the summer sun warm on his shoulders. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed at his bearskin cap, and everything seemed just as it had before. But everything had changed. Carter was awaiting trial, his empire dismantled. The truth about the drug trials had saved countless lives. And somewhere out there, Emily Walker was rebuilding her life, knowing her daughter was safe. The evening papers carried a small story about a former research assistant being granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. She would be reunited with her daughter soon, under a new identity in a new country. Daniel smiled slightly, maintaining his stoic pose. He made the right choice that rainy day, even if it hadn't been the easy one. Sometimes, he realized, protecting people meant more than just standing guard. Sometimes it meant taking a stand. A woman with a stroller passed by, and for a moment their eyes met. She smiled, a genuine, grateful smile, before continuing on her way. Daniel's posture remained perfect, but his heart felt lighter. Some guards protect buildings and boundaries. Others protect something far more precious: the truth, justice, and the lives of those who can't defend themselves. Daniel had chosen his side, and he would make that same choice again every time,